Okay, so as always, this is being recorded and will be posted online. Take it away, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for everybody today. First off, let's figure out the time for the next meeting. I think 2 weeks from now would be March 4th at the same time. Any concerns with that date at all? Otherwise, we'll go with that for now. So today we have a couple things on the agenda. I think Annie would like to talk about layout shift normalization. That was something, unfortunately, we didn't have time to reach during the last meeting about a month ago. We have some issues with element timing and HR time, and something from Yov about BF cache reporting and navigation IDs. So plenty of things to discuss. Annie, if you are up for it, would you want to go first?
Yep. So I wanted to talk today about the cumulative layout shift metric. Are my slides presenting? I'm sorry.
Not currently.
All right, apologies. Let me try to get them up. I'll try reloading. All right.
It's working.
It's working? Okay, great.
Yep.
All right, so just for a quick background here, the layout instability API is like the underlying API that we've worked on and talked a lot about with this group. We're actually not trying to make changes to that API. It provides data about individual layout shifts on a page. And then we have a metric called cumulative layout shift. And it's basically just the sum of the individual layout shifts. And we think that like our top complaint right now about the Core Web Vitals is the fact that it can grow unbounded, and that's causing a lot of developer frustration, particularly for people who have like very long-lived pages. So we did a lot of brainstorming about how we could address the issue in the metric. We tried like about 200 strategies locally and evaluated how they would rank some pages that we had like a user group rated. And we did a pretty long blog post about this. I can answer questions, but it might be easier to read it. But we tried variants of like how windowing CLS, different variants on how we would write statistics about layout shift, like averaging or max or percentiles. We tried some non-windowed approaches, like just the average over time. And there's a couple of top solutions that came out of that. One of them is called a sliding window. So basically, like if you look at these blue lines, they're layout shifts, individual layout shifts over time. Oh, sorry, I have the wrong graphic. A sliding window is just a window that slides over time. So you would just, the window would continually update over time. The graphic is in the blog post. We're considering 300 milliseconds and 1,000 millisecond sliding windows. And then this is actually a session window. So it basically bubbles as you have layout shifts to kind of contain them until it hits a gap. We found that a gap of a second was best. And so you can see this illustration breaks the layout shifts into 3 separate gaps. And we're considering either capping it at 5 seconds or letting it grow uncapped, but it would stop when there's a gap. Instead of just the max window, like perform well for sliding, we're looking at the sum of the layout shifts in the window, or like the average. The max window, but either summing and the max window or max window by like the average of the layout shifts in the window. So those were kind of the 4 that performed really well in our initial tests, and then we implemented those in Chrome and looked at Chrome stable data to kind of give us like more details, like looking at a very large scale analysis. We're still in the midst of that analysis, but I want to share some initial findings that all strategies as expected reduce the correlation with the time spent on site. And then when we ranked like CLS, sites by CLS, and ranked sites by each individual strategy, the sites that rose to the top with the new strategies were all sites that are very long-lived. So it definitely, all of the variations on strategies are accomplishing those goals. But we did find that if we take the average in a session window as opposed to looking at the max in the window, as you'd expect, if you have a very small layout shift and a very large layout shift, like the average is going to normalize that out. And we thought that would be very confusing for developers. Like if they fix that tiny layout shift, then their score would get worse. So we decided that we probably don't want to move forward with the average one. And we also found with the 300 millisecond window that that it was too short, that kind of there could be a burst of layout shift from one event, like a page load or a scroll, or like an interaction, SPA nav, and that it would be broken up into kind of multiple events. So we're really looking at a max over a session window or a max over a sliding window. And I wanted to just give a quick update and ask for feedback on that. We do have like the blog post, and I know some people have already sent in feedback, and I'm really thankful for that. 2 questions in particular we had is that if we're still like basically using a cumulative strategy and it's just capped by a window, do people think it would make sense to rename the metric? We have a lot of developer concern about like too many acronyms and too many names and things like that. And also if people had thoughts on like sliding versus session windows.
Hey, Annie, can you clarify the 5 seconds limit? Like, is there specific web content that repeatedly goes over 5 seconds is where I'm going?
Yeah. So if you have something like it's an infinite scroller and it's janking a tiny bit on each scroll, that if people are social sites, like you can imagine Instagram, Twitter, I'm scrolling, not those specific sites, but I'm scrolling through my feed and I'm just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. That can go tiny layout shifts that they go above 5 seconds. And so we're almost certainly going to have some kind of cap to prevent those sites from scoring too poorly.
Some other common examples are just layout inducing animations or like interval driven page updates, like a table that updates every second.
Yeah, so we saw a lot of like kind of poorly animated like scores popping in. And it wasn't a great experience, but if you've been sitting and looking at scores popping in for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like it's not getting worse.
And Annie, for clarification, for the session window, like that diagram that we were just looking at, the layout shifts within each of those 3 sessions would be summed.
Yeah.
And then out of those 3 windows, you were saying that the sum of that, I mean, I guess it's still just cumulative layout shift, but if you take the average, that's where you're saying, if you take one of them out, then the other one might go down or be worse. How were you planning on aggregating those 3 windows? I guess that's what I'm confused.
I'm sorry, we're going to take the maximum window.
Maximum. Out of all of them, the max one that you ever saw.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So the worst experience, basically.
Yeah. And we've looked at statistics just in like, other statistics, like the 75th percentile experience, yep. the median experience, things like that. Number 1, it's hard for a developer to reason about, like, what exactly are we grading? And then number 2, we found that only very high percentiles correlated with, like, our kind of simulated user experience. And then when you're talking about, like, a 30-second experience and you're saying, like, the 95th percentile session window of 5 seconds, like that's an interpolation, right? So we're essentially saying the max.
And it'd be similar for the sliding window. You're just like finding all of the layout shifts for each slide along the way. And you're finding the worst 1 second experience or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Essentially. Okay. And that's fairly easy to reason then. Okay.
Yeah, I think there are very rare situations where maybe a large sliding window would capture the global maximum, but because of the way the timings are set up, session will always do the same as well. And then session windows have variable amounts of time. And so really that's the biggest difference is a fixed time slice important? Or if they're really closely clumped together, is a user really intuitively clumping them anyway? And so that's like semantically the big difference.
And certainly if we had better browser support or something that would automatically group user experiences and user interactions, maybe we could even group by user experience rather than just these windows. But I think we're trying to look at it from more of the raw point of view rather than like the when after the user clicked X happened kind of point of view.
Yeah, just one comment. Ishan had his hand raised earlier, so I just yeah, we don't typically run a queue on regular meetings, but yeah, so feel free to just speak. But yeah.
Sure. So we read the blog post with a lot of interest. Our feedback is that, to set the stage, a lot of our customers on our platform are e-commerce, high-end, and we're really focused on the flow and use case of e-commerce one. So infinite scroller is one on a category page, but another common one is a user going back and forth from a category page to the product page, and going back and forth between those really, really fast that you can do in a single page application. And so that's kind of what drives our interest. So we prefer session windows out of all the options. There's a little concern that if you have a tap and the user is going back and forth between, into a product page, back to the category, into a product page really quickly, you could actually get a bunch of layout shift in a single interaction or in a single group of those interactions. And maybe, when a user tap occurs, you automatically just end the window there. So we don't like uncapped windows for that reason, as well as we feel like there were some questions we had internally about, users leaving windows open for long periods of time, especially if it goes into the background or even they leave it up and they have the phone open. And we also, you addressed percentile. That was going to be my other question. We felt like percentile over maximum would make sense because they might go through various types of pages, 5 of them product pages, but one of them turns out to have a really bad layout shift and it shouldn't penalize the whole experience. And the last thing is just what wasn't clear to us is if the layout shift will be attributed to the URL of the starting page where the single page app first loaded, or is it going to be attributed to whatever we've dynamically set the URL to on page transition?
It's set to the initial URL.
That's what we figured. Okay, that makes sense. So that's our feedback and where we had. So the most concrete one is like maybe ending your session windows when a tap occurs. I know you get the 500 milliseconds, but it may turn out to be of a bunch of transitions that go past 500, but they've really logically scrolled through or transitioned through 5 or 6 pages, and it just keeps establishing the window because you keep extending the sense of session.
I see. Thank you. That's helpful.
It is. One possibly easy way to accomplish that would be to adjust the gap of the session window to be the same size as the had recent input thing. Now, I don't know what that would do with the data, but that would be a way to get that automatically.
Yeah.
Annie, just to answer your question, I do think that you're proposing is different than CLS as it exists now, so I would appreciate a new name, although I'm not going to get into bike shedding about it. But to me, it sounds like you have cumulative layout shift with 1 second slices over 5 second max of those. So if that's what's actually going on there, then a short version of something like that. But yeah, I would say definitely rename because this feels different.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of different types of tools and services reporting on CLS today already. We have Chrome User Experience Report, we have Web Page Test, we have Lighthouse, we have Impulse, and they all are reporting something ever so slightly different in some cases. But I think I would agree that this metric feels different enough, whatever the worst cumulative layout experience, whatever you want to call it, that would make sense to have it be something else entirely.
Thanks. Anything else? Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the feedback.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing that to us. Okay, why don't we head into, we have some issues. Well, actually, Yoav, do you want to present on your BF Cache stuff before issues or afterward?
I have no strong preference. I can do that now briefly.
Sure.
It's a very short presentation.
Cool.
Okay. So can you take over scribing for this one?
I will do so.
Okay. Let me then copy it and share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. BF cache reporting and navigation IDs. Essentially, on the last meeting a month ago, we talked about BF cache reporting. So just to recap for folks who weren't around, essentially we want to align metrics with user experience, and that includes BF cache navigations. We want BF cache navigations to fire new entries rather than override old entries. We want a single time origin for all the navigations in the document to prevent confusion. We agreed that the best way to go would be to refire or fire new navigation timing entries with a new navigation type. We also concluded that it would be web compatible to do that, as well as fire new paint timing entries and other, like paint timing entries and input events. And then the question is, how do we correlate? How do we correlate those new paint timing entries, as well as other like resource timing entries and other entries that we have to that navigation compared to older navigations? So in the last call, I suggested we will use the time to do that, and Ryosuke from Apple rightfully suggested that this will not be sufficient. So what I'm proposing here is to add a new navigation ID on the performance entry itself. So extending the IDL for performance entry, which that navigation ID will incrementally increase each new navigation that the page, the document goes through. And that would work well for BF Cache now, but it would also work well for other navigation types in the future. And in particular, what we have in mind is to have some sort of a soft navigation navigation type for SPAs that would work well with the proposed app history API. That is very interesting on that front. This is not yet like that work is super early, but it seems to fit the same model, which is good. So the proposed spec changes in order to make that happen are what I have had in mind is to add a navigation ID on-site short to performance entry. Add a counter to the same effect to the document to be initialized as 0, and then increment that counter every time we're hitting a new navigation type. So initially for BF Cache, in the future, we may also increment the counter for soft navigations. And then when queuing any new performance entry, we simply initialize its navigation ID with that variable from the document. And that would create the effect of every new performance entry to be easily correlatable to the latest navigation timing entry that preceded it. And just to illustrate that as a code example, Let's say we want to grab all the entries for each one of those navigations that happen on the page. We collect all the navigation entries, and then we collect all the entries on the page in general, and then simply iterate over the navigations and filter based on entries that have their navigation ID be similar or identical to the navigation timing entry and navigation ID, and then we can do something with them. That is obviously a simplified version with like typically you would probably want to use a performance observer for some of the entries, but the logic would be similar, and we would just like a simple filter logic will be able will enable us to split entries based on navigations. Yeah, so that's all I had as far as slides go, and I would love to hear your feedback on that and whether you think this makes general sense.
Is it planned to be sorry. I was just asking navigation just to be planned to be just increasing number and not kind of a type object that may contain other information, like the type of navigation or something like that?
Yeah, I would prefer not to proliferate that data to all new performance entries because that can make them heavier. It's better to just have an ID, treat it as a pointer, and then you're able to filter entries based on that and get the navigation type or whatever other information you want from the navigation entry directly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, seems reasonable.
Yeah, I do think this is a way to disambiguate, which is my concern the last time we were talking about BF cache. So I really appreciate the work that went into this. I think this is a way forward for sure, and maybe could be used for softmaps. So I like that. Is there like a default number? So I'm just curious about backwards compat or like how this works in the future. If all entries are gonna be numerical, like and then that's maybe not what people are expecting. So are we gonna like alias 0 to no number for usability, or what's the guidance there?
So what I was thinking is that 0 would be like if we had that navigation ID variable or property in the perf entry IDL today and had no, like without BFCAS support, it would just be 0 all the time. And then it would increment over time. I don't think, like from a backwards compatibilities perspective, I doubt that extending the IDL would, I don't think content today is looking for random properties, and if it finds them, it breaks. I would hope not. But yeah, so I don't think backward compatibility would be an issue. But maybe you're suggesting forward compat issues that I'm missing, like, or.
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering, like, I guess you're right. I guess maybe it's just an education thing and telling people that's what these numbers are would do the trick.
Cool.
So I know the performance timeline interface itself, so like get entries and such, we've decided to put less focus on or deprecate or not as much. but your example itself using it suggested that, you know, maybe there are some use cases where people would want to always just segment by the current navigation ID. I mean, would there be any desire to, like we have a get entries by type, or you know,
Yeah.
have a get entries by navigation ID, or as a filter that you pass to it instead of having to do it in JavaScript? Maybe, maybe not. I'm just thinking like for a really long running page, like let's say an SPA, the user's been up for a couple days on their Gmail and they're clicking back and forth a lot. You're going to have thousands of these maybe.
Yeah. So I can imagine. So the code I wrote is just for like I was aiming for something that would fit on a slide. So for a performance observer, I would do something similar, but then do the filtering as part of the observer callback, and then
Right.
you know, add it to an array with all the navigation entries related to it, or yeah, even not even go over the navigation. Just you know, have an array that splits on navigation ID, and then like each cell in the navigation ID is an object, like another array that contains all the entries that is fed from the performance observer. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this particular example. Regarding your question about like, do we want get entries by ID? I generally think that all these get entries by something is a pattern we had before we had filters. Mm-hmm. And filters enable people to do whatever they like, split on whatever dimension that they want. And to be honest, like even from an internal implementation perspective, it's not like they are significantly more efficient than something external that takes a
JavaScript,
longer list and cuts it down. So I don't really see a need to add a dedicated API unless people strongly disagree.
I think that's fair. I was trying to think if there was any use cases that people would be using the performance timeline and want to split it rather than just using a performance observer. And I think every case I can think of, you would just be wanting to be using the observer and doing your own filtering anyway. So, okay.
I mean, we might want an API to clear all previous navigations potentially.
So we have an API for clearing resource timing.
Right.
And
clears everything.
It's a mistake. It clears everything, but the problem is if you have a page with multiple third-party actors, we've had cases where one steps on the feet of the others and clears buffers in like accidentally.
Yeah, we had that as well.
Yeah. So I think it's better to have like performance observer enables you to register whenever you care about things and unregister whenever you don't. And there's no real need to clear the buffers.
Would it make sense to change the get entry by what is it, by type, right? And include the navigation ID parameter so it would do the filtering for you?
So that's basically like the question that Nick asked, more or less.
Sorry.
I think no, it's fine. I think it doesn't really make sense because we have filters today that can do that with relatively small amount of code.
Yeah, but in terms
terms
of the amount of memory that you would use when calling that, it's quite different because filtering from JavaScript means you're already using the memory, so it's kind of a waste.
I agree that filtering by ID could theoretically be better. Looking at least Chromium's current implementation, it's not like we're doing any better internally for like at least for get entries by name. It's just yeah, it's not significantly different from getting the entire list and then filtering it afterwards. So, but I'm open to, like, if people think that it would be a useful API to have, that I'm open to.
The other thing is, for example, if you have an observer and you were interested in a specific navigation ID, then would that be something useful, or do you think that's not a common use case?
I think as an observer, I would not want to limit myself to the current navigation. Like, I'd want to make sure that I'd be able to also listen to new navs without having to register a new observer. Because, like,
Yeah.
I would imagine you would only ever observe the current one, but you may also want to observe future ones as well. And I don't think you'd want to limit yourself just to the current one.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I'm just thinking, if you ever wanted to like register an observer after BF cache, then it would be a bit annoying in that you just get everything from the previous navigation as well.
If you're using the buffered flag is what you're thinking. Gotcha.
Maybe it's worthwhile to, like, I think that it's a discussion that would be significantly more productive to have once people have some experience in the field with playing around with those kind of navigations and seeing what, like, are the common patterns. So maybe it's worthwhile to decouple that, because it's not necessarily, like, there's no real need to tie those two together, and people can filter now and then move to a newer, shinier API, like get entries by ID, if get entries by navigation ID, if that would be something we'll add in the future. So does that make sense to maybe decouple those discussions, and then potentially we can add that sugar on top later?
Or expose it instead of an API, like expose it as a an array property, so you can have like navigations and then access it by the navigation ID directly, like an array indexer to get the entries.
Like a map?
Yeah, like a map, yeah. I don't know if it's more ergonomic, just.
So right now, if you get the, performance get entries by type navigation gives you an array-like thing that you can already, go to. But you want all the entries related mapped to that.
Right, to that navigation ID. Because you're introducing a new concept, a new grouping concept called navigation ID, which I find useful. I'm just thinking what would be a useful and easy way to process it. So could be an API, or it can be just a direct lookup from a map.
I mean, that's still new API surface, right? We don't have that right now. So
yeah. Just suggestion.
I think it might be, like similar to the, like, I think it would be interesting to discuss this once we have some implementation experience, and you and Nick and others can play around with with those concepts, see what's the best way to split, see what what API shapes or what usage patterns emerge in the wild, and then try to converge on that. Does that make sense?
Seems reasonable.
Cool.
I do like the concept of the navigation ID, and I like that it's forward-looking for integrating single-page app navs, as Benjamin was saying and stuff. So, agreed.
So speaking of being forward-looking, I think that we absolutely should have a navigation ID, and I like this proposal. But to Noam's earlier point about perhaps making it a structure that's more complicated, like fundamentally, this is about segmenting perf entries based on their like logical grouping. And I do think that Benjamin, at least in the past, has thrown around what about visibility or long periods of idle time or app switching, where you might have the same navigation ID, but you might want to distinguish perf entries. So, potentially in the future, we just add another type of ID, which is some sort of slice or session. But another option is to think about that now, make it a more complex structure.
I don't think we've agreed that we need to segment all the performance entries that way, though. Like, for example, resource timing is the most commonly used, and I don't think it makes sense to segment them that way. So it's unclear if it would belong in performance entry, right? Like, this is something that needs to be applicable to at least majority of the performance data we expose.
Yeah.
Got it. So everything needs a navigation ID, but only some things might need this other type of slicing. Okay.
Potentially, yeah. And I also suspect that a lot of the slicing and dicing is something that will happen on the server side for presentation to developers' purposes rather than on the client side before uploading the data. So it's yeah, I'm worried of creating like an extremely complex machinery when we already have JavaScript and filters that can enable any custom slicing and dicing that may be needed on the client side. But yeah, again, I may be wrong, and implementation experience will prove it one way or the other.
So I guess the question here is whether we would want to expose a new, like, first content for paint for when you become visible. Because the whole point of the navigation ID is that we need to distinguish between the same kinds of entries because they're dispatched twice in the same page load because of multiple navigations. So unless we plan to do that, then then I would see no need for the visibility ID.
Yeah, I don't know if we would ever expose paint on that, but I do think that, for example, layout shifts with each individual layout shift, it might be interesting to know that there was a long idle period of background and then visibility.
And you can already know that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and visibility observers will give you even better ways to get that information even retroactively.
Yeah. But it's a similar question, right? Like navigation entries give you the ability to listen to them and slice the data by listening to the events, looking at the timeline, looking at the start times and slicing. So by that argument, you can also do the same thing manually with the thing. So this is a convenience thing, but I concede that it's there will be a way to raise this question later without having to introduce the more complex structure now. Just throwing that out there. It is future-proof, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that if we were to consider in the future, backgrounding and foregrounding is a new thing, maybe we can just increment the ID in those cases if we want to expose new things when that happens.
Maybe. I wouldn't call it a navigation, though.
That is correct. Yeah, but I don't know that we would actually.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, do I want to bike shed on the name right now, or?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that wouldn't be super productive. What I suggest as next steps is for me to create various PRs on the various specifications related to that, because this is a change that touches on performance timeline, HTML, and pane timing at least, if not more. So I will open PRs and then maybe send them over to the list for greater scrutiny, and then we can have discussions on those on those PRs. And specifically, if we're talking about byte shedding, it's the performance timeline PR that will be of interest. Does that make sense?
Yes. Hey, I had I'm probably wrong here, but I'm just curious. Like, if we have monotonically increasing session IDs, then isn't the largest the one that could be visible? And if it's not the largest, then it's definitely not visible? Or is this whole visibility discussion something we really don't want to have? I'm intrigued by what Michael said. I think like this may be a way to be helpful for the visibility question.
Yeah, so I think it can, or like visibility is not necessarily, like users could theoretically click on the back button, then switch to a new tab before, you know, very quickly, and then this whole BF cache navigation would be invisible for most of its time, even if, you know, a small number of milliseconds would still be visible. It's interesting to think about. Yeah, I'm not sure that we want to treat visibility sessions as new navigations and then expose specific things on them. If we would, then maybe we want to make the ID a float rather than a short, and then, you know, have navigation.1.1. I don't know. Nicholas doesn't like me now.
Nope.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, we can probably I guess I'm missing concrete examples of what we would want to expose for those visibility sessions. And I agree with you that in principle it's an interesting area to explore, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what to do with it right now.
That's fine. I just wanted to note that what Michael said, there might anything we can do to improve clarification of visibility would be worthwhile. And I feel like this is solving other problems. That's great. But I like the fact that it might be able to discard a whole bunch of what is visible from the solution set. I feel like if we could get that as a bonus, then let's take it. You know, that's all I want to say.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So if there's nothing else, I think we can move on to the next issue.
Sounds great. Thanks for the presentation. So we are going to jump over to an element timing issue. Let's see, we have about 10 minutes left, so we can probably get through 2 or 3 of these issues. So this is element timing issue number 54. And there's a issue opened by John around image rendering stages, finer granularity.
I can speak to that probably. Essentially, right now for element timing, we only expose. So we expose the load time, which is identical to the onload event and what we already exposed in resource timing, and then we expose the render time for the image, but it's the render time for all the bytes of the image. The image is complete, rendered, and that is the point in time that we expose. JPEG XL folks who are in the process of finalizing a format that is progressive are somewhat unhappy with just exposing the final time because it doesn't show the fact that they are like that JPEG XL images present something to the user earlier compared to other formats like AVIF. So what John is Jan actually suggesting here is have multiple stages where we don't only expose the final render time, but also the time in which we have the dimensions, we have some placeholder paint or a blur hash, we have a preview paint, which is not the final image, but it gives the user a better sense of what's there, a good enough paint for some definition of good enough, and then the final image. So he is suggesting to add that to element timing, and yeah, from my perspective, it seems interesting information. I'm not 100% sure what people will do with that, but yeah, it would be interesting to chat about. Does anyone here would find that information useful?
I guess only when you try to evaluate how long it took for the user to get some kind of gesture. Let's say that image is maybe, I don't know, a spinner or a loading or some kind of image like that. And you want to know that he got some gesture, especially on slow connections where it might take longer to load. I don't know. I'm just kind of hypothesizing here. I don't know exactly what
But
would
is
be
the image actually rendering before it finishes loading in that case? Like a spinner sounds like a very small thing,
right.
right?
And a spinner is also animation, right? So
yeah,
I don't know what that would mean in that specific scenario that he suggests.
Yeah, because there's also the final image. I think it's the first. I don't know, Nicholas. Do you remember what it's defined for animations? Is this the first frame or the full animated image?
Yeah, I think we don't do a great job with animations. I think it will wait for it to finish loading.
So maybe if it was like sorry, Nicholas. If it was like an app, I'm just imagining an app that has multiple thumbnails. I don't know, when you click on it and then it shows the full image somewhere, right? And then it might not have the image, the full high resolution image in memory yet, loaded yet. So you want to know how long it took to show the, how we call it, the blur hash or whatever.
Yeah, but in those cases, typically you would have a separate image as the thumbnail, and then when you click it, it loads the real like full image.
So this is only things for progressive images in particular, right? If it's a new image, then you can already measure that. So this is a use case specifically for images that are progressive, I think. Progressively rendered.
That's what I feel.
There's kind of a weird line where baseline images still draw incrementally, right? So I guess you're separating the incremental painting for progressive images from the incremental painting for baseline images, and not all browsers paint progressively either. But you're almost wanting to define it as like an event for each time the entire image area is changed, if you would, as each scan completes, or the time that the entire image dimensions is updated. But you have to also be careful. I mean, it could be interesting to do that in an animated GIF or something as well, but you probably don't want that many callbacks. But I could see, like, there's a few companies that have even non-XL but regular JPEG where they use custom scans, and like the first version of the image is a grayscale version of the image, and then they add the color afterwards. Thinking Pinterest, but I can't remember exactly. And so in those cases, they might want to know when each scan completes, and that avoids adding logic about what's first, what's good, what's not. They can, on their own, determine 2 scans versus 8 scans, or however many scans in the image we serve is where we want to draw the threshold.
So if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting instead of having multiple defined entries, you're suggesting just an array of these are all the times where scans happen. This is scan number 1, scan number 2, etc.
But only if they were painted at the scan time, right?
Yeah, or the paint time of those scans, I guess. Yeah.
So I'm from Pinterest actually, and we have a custom metric called pinner wait time, and that includes the load or the rendering times of all the images in the viewport. The definition is supposed to be for 60% quality for our progressive JPEGs. So it's not necessarily that we want to monitor every single scan, but we just want to be notified of that specific point at which our quality threshold is met.
Right, and in that case, you'd pick out like the scan in the array that was equivalent to 60%.
Yeah.
So we need to expose for every scan the quality measured as a, I don't know, percent. Well, I'm not sure how the...
No, I don't think the browser needs to know or care. I think that's up to whoever's doing the serving to know, okay, this is a 10 scan image. I care about the 6th scan or the 4th scan.
I don't know if that will work though, right? Like, are we guaranteed to paint every single scan of the image in the browser? I think if we receive it really quickly, we're just going to paint the full image, right?
Yeah, there's no one-to-one mapping, but yeah. Yeah, but we could theoretically say, okay, this is the time where scans 1 to 2 were painted. This is scans 3 to 5.
I guess if you do a percentage based on the number of scans, not on the assumed quality.
Or number of bits.
No, even number of bits won't tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and Giacomo made a comment on chat that this is also potentially useful for LCP. I think that for LCP we have a different discussion. From my perspective, LCP's semantics are more aligned with the good enough paint at the very least, rather than all the different, because one of the goals for LCP is to be a single number rather than an array of scans that can be useful for some scenarios, but may not be useful for everyone. So yeah, we have a separate issue related to LCP that I don't remember the number of, where essentially I think we somewhat converged on good enough for LCP semantics. And Benjamin, isn't this an extended version of paint timing applied per element? Potentially. I'm not sure, like, do you... Thanks, Nicholas.
First paint is placeholder paint, and then first contentful paint is preview paint. I don't know how LCP actually falls into that, but anyway, I'm just saying, like, let's.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying there are parallels between those milestones and the milestones for the full page render. I agree that there are parallels. There are also, like, I guess that depends on the level of details that we'll want to expose here in terms of, yeah, if we expose every scan that goes beyond what we currently expose for the page itself. Unless you count each time we fire like a request animation frame as a, you know, a paint, but we don't really expose any information on what's painted at that point.
So we're running out of time, or we're out of time, I should say. How would we want to follow up on this, either through the ticket or continue the discussion elsewhere?
I think it can be useful for folks who have opinions or, better yet, use cases for this to comment on the issue and, you know, say, this is how I would use this. And yeah, Patrick, maybe you want to comment, like, outline your suggestion of having a more flexible structure that is tied to scans, and then we can see how that expands to, like, I don't know if this is like JPEG specific or can expand to other image types. Yeah, so essentially, I think we should continue discussion on the issue. Does that make sense?
I think it sounds great.
Okay, cool.
All right, thank you everybody for joining today. We had 2 issues that we didn't get to around HR time today. We'll move them to next time, and we'll also talk about some other things, worker start and such. So thanks everyone for joining today.
Cheers.